Hello all, I'm Kel Kidman and welcome to Breaking on the Daily, where today we're going to begin with some of the results of the second investigation from the WHO with regard to the origins of the China virus. And, well, it's not going exactly very well, because the WHO and the scientists that were involved in this particular investigation have been defending China from doing things which are not very great. So, what we have discovered from some of the comments that have been made about this investigation in particular is we have discovered that China has potentially destroyed the raw data from the original coronavirus infections back in December in Wuhan. That they did not give over the raw data and rather gave specific, generalized sets of data, and that there was, quote, heated arguments about this particular subject between the investigators and the Chinese officials. Now, the media reported on this, of course, and many on the media, particularly those who are honest, said, this looks like the Chinese weren't exactly being completely honest with the investigators, and it looks like this investigation got pretty much nothing done. Of course, seeing as the WHO regularly capitulates to China on many an occasion, the particular scientists and investigators who were making these claims, and were talking about this sort of thing, claim that, the media is twisting our words. Well, I'll put it bluntly. That allegation that the media was twisting their words to gain a different meaning as to, that is somewhat different to what they meant it to be, is, in fact, accurate. They did twist the words that they directly said. However, why they twisted it was because they wanted to twist it out of the mangled mess that the original statement was, couched in all of the China capitulation that it was, bringing out, in the process, all of the useful information from those words. And this is an important distinction to make, because throughout argumentation and all this sort of stuff, as you'll come across when either arguing on the internet or looking at something that people are arguing about, there will be common accusations of people twisting the words of another to make some sort of point. And this happens all the time. A good example from recent is actually the Time article that I will continue to bring up, given every excuse to do so, because it's just that important. The Time article, people claimed that the right, particularly the left claimed, that the right was twisting the words of the Time article by saying, no, they said they fortified the election and didn't directly admit to doing any crimes. Though, of course, that is simple framing. It is framing from the perspective of the originator of the source. If we remove that framing and simply look at what was directly said and what useful information we got out of it, from the Time article, we got information that a group of people was working to manipulate the election to prevent Donald Trump from winning. And in this case, we got China wasn't being honest about their numbers and refused to give raw data, probably because it made them look bad. Now, of course, the Global Times, a China-run newspaper, and that's an interesting name for a Chinese-run newspaper. Just a comment to be made there. Then came out and talked about these particular comments that were made by these scientists and investigators, and praised them and mixed it in together with a bunch of Chinese commentators who are trying to pawn off the fault for the China virus onto the U.S., because, of course, that's what China's want to do. And it's funny because China manipulated and twisted their words just as much, if not more, than the original media outlets did. The reason being is that China took their already twisted words, already capitulated words, and removed any semblance of useful information from it to prevent anyone who's even looking at the Global Times article from even amassing a proper perspective on the subject. Whereas before, with the actual statements from the scientists, you could glean off certain amounts of information and then untwist the words into some viable usage for media articles like you'd see in a place like Breitbart or any other place that's being honest about what China's doing. The Global Times took the already twisted words of the scientists, twisted them even more, and then there was nothing left. Twisted it into oblivion. And this is sort of common among many media organizations. It's a very common propaganda tactic. They will twist the words to make it so that they're not technically lying, but they are also not really being honest either. You see the same thing happen with Andrew Cuomo just yesterday when I was talking about that. He was doing a very similar thing, calling his lies by omission an information void and pretending that he had no culpability in any of the sort of policies he was pursuing, despite their obvious lack of commonsensical thought or forethought at all. Despite all that, he continues to peddle this sort of misinformation. But in that particular press conference, he never directly lied. And I never claimed he did. But he was being incredibly dishonest. And the way he was doing that is by twisting his words so that you got some useful information if you tried to untwist the words. But they were so twisted that they could easily be misinterpreted as being something else, which can then be gleamed onto by any other media organization that's friendly to those sorts of comments, and twisted even more, given the license they have, considering they didn't originally make the comments, and completely remove all useful information from those comments to make it seem as though it's saying something that it really isn't, and completely ignoring the actual important bits. This is a common tactic because lying outright is never really a good option. And the reason is because if it is ever discovered that you lied outright and that your information that you said was directly false, then when that sort of thing comes back, it comes back to bite you, and it bites you hard. But if you just manipulate a few things, twist a few things, omit certain details, then you can get away with it. Because you can say, well, the fundamentals of my statement weren't dishonest necessarily. It was just framed in such a way to manipulate the way you're looking at it. And that's what these scientists in particular are doing here. And the Global Times, since they didn't make the original statement, has even more license to twist the story and twist their words again, completely out of shape and completely remove all useful information, because even then, even though they've twisted out all useful information from the statements, they aren't technically lying. And of course, it goes the other way. You can also twist the statement back into some form of useful thought and keep all of the useful stuff and remove some of the not useful stuff. And that's something that needs to be decided on a case-by-case basis. We can't really trust anyone to be completely accurate with how they're manipulating certain information or how they're presenting it and that sort of thing. And that's something that needs to be really more understood by a whole lot of people. And to move on to our next story, and this one's a pretty jovial one. Fulton County in Georgia, their election board director has been fired by the elections board because he did a heinous job of doing the 2020 election. And you guys wonder why I say we should be focusing on local change and why we should be focusing on state change. Because it turns out that in almost every scenario, local change is not only more effective, not only faster, but something that is much more long-lasting than something like federal change, which can change on the whims of the entire nation, as opposed to what happens in local politics and state politics, where it depends entirely on the character of the state and locality. And an important thing to be said is that the character of the state vacillates much less than the character of the country. All right? The country goes back and forth between having Republican or Democrat governments all the time. It's every 4 to 8 years this sort of thing happens. But with local and state governments, there is many more examples of politicians and parties having extremely long runs of having exclusively Republican or exclusively Democrat rule. Now, some of this is due to the fact that rigging a local election or a state election, it can be easier given specific circumstances, but it also has to do with the fact that the character of any particular state is much more long-lasting than it is over the entire country, because the entire country includes a whole lot of different types of places. It includes California, and it also includes somewhere like South Dakota. It includes some place like Utah, it includes a place like Arizona, or Montana, or Oregon, and all of the 50 states. And all of these 50 states have a different character. But that character of the state changes on a much slower level, and it changes much more gradually than the national character does, and as it vacillates between being center-right and center-left. And so, manipulating and trying to get change in the political system will always be more effective, particularly in the United States, going from local up, rather than trying to focus on our national efforts to begin with. And this has been the problem, as I've stated many times before, with third parties. Third parties, they focus all of their efforts on national politics and get about 1 to 5% of the populace in national politics. As I've stated many times before, if they focused all of their national money on a particular state, they might be able to win that state. Because you can find a state where you have 5% of the population of the U.S. in that one particular state. If you spend all of your time convincing that 5% of the population to vote for you, that's a much easier deal than trying to convince 50% of the national population in the entire national election, which is what you would need in order to be even really contestable. You'd have to be up there for it to really work, because there's a large difference between being at 1% and being at 50%, and that's kind of where how American, particularly national American politics works. And that's just something that gets missed a lot. But to get back to the actual story itself, this is a pretty good thing, though it is unclear if the body that actually fired the guy in this particular instance actually had the ability to fire him. It's still something that isn't really decided at all. And so it is yet to be seen whether this has any weight at all. But I hope it does, and certainly this sort of state-level corruption is going to be rooted out largely in the Georgia legislature, I imagine, over the next 2 years, particularly if Georgia citizens actually pressure their government to do that, which I'm sure they can, and I'm sure that many are trying at this point, though I would say that more need to be trying, because we need to be seeing these sorts of stories every day, every week. All right, we need to see this sort of story at least weekly, I would say, or at least I would want it to see it at least weekly. This shouldn't be like a once a month or once every 2 months sort of thing. Though, to move on to our next story, and this one's more national oriented. Bill Gates is now beginning to advocate for rich countries to live off of 100% synthetic beef. Man. I've seen a lot of talk about this particular story on the Twitters and whatnot, and I separate from many people's takes on that. And there is a large contingent of people who are saying that, no, Bill Gates isn't trying to advocate for public policy or anything. No. He's not trying to advocate for that. He's trying to advocate for cultural shifts. He's trying to advocate for people to voluntarily do this sort of stuff. Yeah, I don't believe it. This sort of thing, 100% synthetic beef, 100% people making any particular decision, no matter what that decision may be, all right, no matter how eminently good it may be, if you were advocating for 100% of people doing that, it requires government intervention, no matter what it is, all right? Whether it be unemployment, whether it be insurance or healthcare or anything. If you're advocating for 100% of people to have or do one particular thing, you are advocating for the government to come in and say, you have to do this. That is what you are advocating for. That is what you are necessarily advocating for, because of the simple fact that people are different. And people are sometimes different to great extremities. And I could speak on and on about the irony of Bill Gates talking about this when his favorite food is hamburgers, and how he seems to be reticent to actually take this sort of advice himself and actually live his word. But I'm not going to, at least not by and large, because I don't see really the need to. This sort of thing is absurd enough on its face to be dismissed out of hand, especially when you're trying to advocate for, say, green energy that isn't nuclear. Now, I'm not exactly sure about Bill Gates' particular position on nuclear power, or though I do know his position on green energy more broadly, that being that he wants green energy to be readily adopted by many people. And that sort of thing, particularly in the interim, is going to be very prohibitive when it comes to adopting a full beef diet. It's simply not going to happen the way he's expecting it to, and of course he's been advocating for all sorts of government interventions. He's one of the principal advocates for things like mask mandates and things like lockdowns, and so this sort of thing is not exactly surprising to see from Bill Gates, especially since he's gone really off the deep end when it comes to things of government intervention. And I would say that his character has actually substantially changed from where he was in the early 90s and before then. Where before it is worth it to mention that before 1995, Microsoft gave almost nothing in terms of lobbying the government. It wasn't actually until the antitrust problems of Microsoft came up that they actually started lobbying the government millions of dollars a year. And I have a feeling that sort of changed and colored Bill Gates' perception of government and its necessity and that sort of thing, particularly what happened afterwards and how effective that government lobbying actually was. Because, as you might have noticed over the past 25 years, there aren't exactly a whole lot of antitrust suits coming after Microsoft now, are there? These sorts of issues don't really come up once they start lobbying the government heavily. Strange. It's almost like antitrust is a sort of a cat's paw, a honeypot, if you will. It's complete nonsense. That's my opinion on antitrust. Because name me a single time where antitrust has actually accomplished its stated goal. I'll wait. I don't think it's ever happened, actually. Yeah, so that's where that ends. To move on to our last story. This is kind of a doozy. Parler has already run into issues, and this particular story is about Milo Yiannopoulos being banned off of Parler because he's trying to get banned off of Parler. Now, in this particular article, it is at least implied that this has something to do with Parler's change in terms of service and their community guidelines, saying that, there may be new hate speech guidelines and whatnot, but as you may have noticed if you watched my video yesterday, I have read the community guidelines and the new updated community guidelines from Parler, and they don't include such language. No. This story is not a story of Parler abandoning free speech. Not in the slightest. It's an example of Milo being a provocateur and knowing that if you want to get banned off of any site that has any sort of rules, it is not difficult. Alright? It is not difficult to get banned off of anywhere. And for a platform that Milo actually likes, like, I don't know, Gab, it's actually easier to get banned. All you have to do on Gab to get banned is to post a sexually explicit photograph. That's all you have to do. If you do that, instantly banned. On Parler, he had to send many, many parlays, all of which are calling for death threats, and though they may be called jokes, have no punchline. For all Parler knows, and for all, more specifically, Washington Post, New York Times, CNN, hit pieces know, they are accurate representations of Milo Yiannopoulos' views. The problem with this particular story, and the reason that this infuriates me, is because people are claiming all over the place that, oh, Parler has abandoned free speech. It's the same as Twitter. It's going to be just as bad. All the while complaining about a particular story in which Milo Yiannopoulos, while Parler is in a precarious situation where not only all of the big tech companies like Google or Amazon and all of these sorts of media organizations like the New York Times, Washington Post, HuffPost, and the like are all standing over their shoulder looking at every single move they make, but also the government and the regulators are looking over every single thing they make, trying to find a single excuse to get them shut down. That's the scenario here. So, when Milo Yiannopoulos posts a bunch of things which are indistinguishable from legitimate death threats, he gets banned. When in their terms agreement, when in their community guidelines, they explicitly state, you cannot make death threats, you cannot call for violence. I don't know why this is a controversy. These sort of policies exist everywhere. And you might say, oh, well, no, this is a joke. No, what Milo Yiannopoulos said was all a joke. But here's the thing. Milo Yiannopoulos' posts, what he says, most of the time, are not jokes until they get a reaction. And the reason they are not jokes until they get a reaction is because Milo Yiannopoulos is a provocateur. He is someone who explicitly tries to make people mad and tries to make people react to him. That's his job. That's why he exists. And that's also why he fell off the face of the planet and after his deplatforming completely lost all prominence. Because after that happened, there were no more Twitter pansies to react to him. This is his normal shtick. And it's not helpful in this instance. Because it is not difficult to get banned, as I've alluded to before. No matter what platform you're talking about, including a place like 4chan, where you can post pretty much anything, it is not difficult to get banned if you are trying, alright? Because on 4chan, you can't post pictures from a particular movie that was released on Netflix. It goes by the name of Cuties, if you remember correctly. So if you were trying to get banned on 4chan, you just do that, explicitly violate the rules, and guess what? You get banned. In this case, Milo Yiannopoulos looked at Parler's rules, said, I want to try to get banned, and then use that to manipulate people and trying to goad people into not liking Parler. And then he did. This shouldn't be surprising. It shouldn't even be controversial. This is not an example of Parler limiting free speech at all. It's actually an example of Milo Yiannopoulos getting exactly what he wanted. Because he wanted to get banned. He explicitly was testing the censors according to his own words. That's what he was trying to do. So these sorts of rules do not get tested by people who are purposely trying to violate them. They get tested in normal usage of a platform where you aren't necessarily trying to get banned, but also aren't self-censoring yourself. Which is why another example actually put up in this article is a bit more worrying to me, though I don't have enough context to necessarily make a statement either way, where another person who actually wasn't trying to get banned did. That's more worrying to me, because that seems to be, an actual banning. Though, of course, people complain about this the same way they complain about BitChute removing things that are potentially illegal. It's completely ridiculous. They're obligated to follow the law, guys. Parler's obligated to follow U.S. law. Alright, and if you're on there calling for violence, even if it is in a joking manner, when what constitutes a joking manner is essentially saying it with a straight face, but then when they react to you, you laugh at them, what are they supposed to do? Especially when they're walking on pins and needles, when they're in a very precarious situation where they're just coming back, and of course they have all of the hiccups that are coming with that. What are they supposed to do? Are they supposed to just sit there and say, well, you can just do that? When they have the potential of Washington regulation regulating them out of existence over their shoulder? Is that what they're supposed to do? I get tired so much of the sort of tribalism that occurs among alt-tech platforms. Because it is even worse than I'd say for people who are tribalists to Twitter. Because what happens is that people who are on Gab do not like Minds and do not like Parler. People who are on Minds do not like Parler and do not like Gab. And people who are on Parler, I would say I don't see it as much, but I'm sure there's a contingent of people on Parler who don't like Minds and don't like Gab. All for different reasons, okay? Because all of these platforms regulate certain different things. But none of these platforms, and I think this is an important thing to be said, regulate actual political positions that don't involve violence. None of them do that. So I don't see any problem with any of these policies, at least as of now. Could this change with Parler? Could I be wrong? Could this be affecting them more deeply? Yeah. But this Milo story has nothing to do with that. And it's really silly to see all of these conservative purity spiralers, as I've been wont to call them as of recent, continue to harp on Parler about this. Or complain that they're a honey trap because publicly available data was archived. It is really funny to see that sort of thing. In case it's not entirely clear, I am anti-purity spiraling in this case. And I'm anti-purity spiraling more broadly. It's why I'm not obsessed with trying to get rid of every single Republican who didn't vote to object on January 6th. It's why I don't care about Mike Lee and his not doing that. Though it does lower his reputation in my mind, it's not lowering it so much to where I'm not going to vote for the guy when he comes up for re-election. The reason for that is because I can depend on him to actually vote with the Republicans on principled matters when it comes down to it. He's still at like a B, okay? Because before he was at like an A+, and now he's just a B. But that is not to say that there is no gatekeeping that can be done. Because there is a level of gatekeeping that can and probably should be done. Mitt Romney is a good example. I'm not a fan of Mitt Romney, and gatekeeping against him, who seems to not even really be a Republican in the first place, is entirely reasonable. He doesn't seem to believe in Republican values, period. So that's reasonable. Trying to get rid of Mike Lee because he didn't vote one time on one thing where his vote wouldn't have even made a difference on its own, when every other example that you can point to is him being very stalwart and actually defending conservative principles? No, that's not worth purity spiraling over. And it is a tendency that has been emerging on the right that I'm not a fan of. And I really don't want to see it extend. Because we've gone far enough in terms of purity spiral. All right, we really do not want to go any farther than the actual rhinos. People like Mitt Romney. All right, I wouldn't even say purity spiral against Ben Shapiro. Because Ben Shapiro, though I have my problems with him, he's not a rhino, okay? He's not a neocon. He's a milquetoast, conservative libertarian type. That's about it. I have problems with him, mostly in the fact that he trusts particular institutions way too much. Things like polling and other such institutions. I think he trusts the scientific establishment too much as well. But other than that, in terms of actual principle, he's fine. He's okay. And I didn't like when people were mischaracterizing his position on the GameStop thing, because he wasn't against the GameStop traders. He thought what they were doing was stupid, but well, from an objective standpoint, what they were doing was kind of dumb. From a financial standpoint, it was kind of dumb. But he was pro the right to do it and called out Robinhood almost immediately once they actually shut down trading. That's something that people don't mention. I don't know. I have my problems with him, but he's not a neocon. I hate to break it to all of the people who continue to claim that, despite the fact that he's not. Well, and I think that's where I'm going to leave us here today. Wherever you are, if you've made it to the end of this video, subscribe, unless you're on YouTube, in which case subscribe anywhere else. There are lots of pretty links down in the description of places which are much more amenable to conservative content than this website is. And, I have a lot more fun on those platforms as well. So, this has been Breaking on the Daily. I'm Kel Kidman, and I'm out.